Imagine a Plymouth runway circa 1621. Black coats, towering hats, and those infamous silver buckles strutting by. Très chic, right? If pilgrims really dressed like that, goth teens would have fit right in at the first Thanksgiving, bonding over their shared love of somber fashion and existential dread. Thanks to movies, textbooks, and Aunt Edna's never-ending Thanksgiving decor, most of us picture pilgrims as if they just hopped out of a monochrome autumn catalog, sporting more buckles than a 80s Halloween costume party gone wild. Historical plot twist. Real pilgrim style was all about earthy browns, dusty grays, and muted tones. The original capsule wardrobe before it was cool. Why? Bright dyes were a luxury in the New World, and those famous silver buckles? Nope. Laces and ties were the true MVPs of pilgrim footwear. Buckles wouldn't make their debut until 50 years later, basically the Apple Watches of their day. Shiny, desirable, but for future trendsetters. So next time you spot a buckle-happy pilgrim decoration, remember, fashion myths are fun, but real history? Always in style. Beyond attire, popular perceptions of early colonists also paint their political sentiments in broad strokes. If you think King George III was every colonist's personal arch-nemesis, hold your redcoats. History's way less dramatic than Hollywood scripts. The movies would have you believe every American was busy stitching anti-George pillows and threatening effigies with pitchforks. The truth? The colonies were basically a reality show called Revolutionary Fence-Sitters. Instead of one giant anti-royal block party, society split neatly into thirds. Loyalists, fence-sitters, and revolutionaries. Some folks genuinely liked old George, maybe because he never dreamed of taxing sheep. Others couldn't care less, too lost in worries over the next harvest to fret about treason or tyranny. The rebels were noisy, sure, but for much of the early conflict, they were the minority. The Declaration of Independence cast George as the villain, but that was part rallying cry, part student council campaign speech. Contrary to popular belief, hatred of the king wasn't universal. If it were, the revolution would have been more packed than a colonial tavern on tax day, and infinitely messier. While opinions about leadership varied, assumptions about colonial living conditions were also often oversimplified. Picture America. Endless log cabins dotting the wilderness, each chimney puffing charm into the frontier air. Nostalgic, right? If every early American really lived in a log cabin, the country would have been renamed the United States of Timberland, with flannel uniforms and a lumberjack national anthem to match. But here's the real plot twist. Not every pioneer was starring in their own rustic HGTV episode, swinging axes and building cozy cabins from scratch. Reality check. Many settlers started out in dugouts, sod houses, leaky tents, or crammed in with cousins. Because let's face it, Instagram-worthy log cabins are hard to build when your local Home Depot only stocks dirt. Those classic log cabins were only a thing where trees grew. Pioneers crossing prairies or deserts. They didn't just skip town, they skipped the logs too. And forget about forever homes. These cabins were often temporary, more wooden panic rooms than dreamy retreats. The log cabin legend? Fuel for campaign ads. Abe Lincoln and William Henry Harrison both borrowed a little extra timber to spruce up their resumes. Meanwhile, city folk happily embraced apartment or row house life, and the wealthy imported bricks or stone long before real estate envy was a thing. So before you romanticize rustic chic, just imagine the influencer's nightmare, trying to capture cabin life, living in a dirt hole. Not quite the vibe. Housing styles aside, many narratives depict early colonial social events in an idealized way. Let's clear the Thanksgiving fog. That iconic feast wasn't a warm kumbaya cuddle over a communal gravy boat. The popular tale serves up a seamless potluck where pilgrims and Wampanoag joyfully passed the perfectly sliced pumpkin pie. Spoiler alert, no one brought canned cranberry sauce, mainly because cans hadn't been invented. And honestly, would friendship survive the rattling thud of a wobbly cylinder? The myth expects you to believe everyone pitched in equally, packed leftovers into Tupperware, and parted with beaming smiles all the way back to their settlements. But facts, those pesky party poopers, tell a different story. The 1621 gathering wasn't a mutual gratitude bash, but a tense diplomatic ballet. The Wampanoag didn't RSVP for pie. They showed up alerted by pilgrim gunfire, curiosity, or maybe a healthy dose of self-preservation, in tow. Massasoit, their leader, wasn't swapping casserole tips. He was brokering strategic alliances under colonial pressure. This so-called feast stretched over 3 awkward days, simmering with power plays and the unmistakable aroma of looming conflict. Trust us, nobody asked for the recipe. Most guests were plotting survival, not seconds. If true friendship had blossomed, Hallmark surely would have released a card by Mayflower Year 2. Despite portrayals of communal harmony, the daily lives and appearances of colonists are frequently misunderstood. Imagine a world where everyone stood under 5 feet tall and only showered when it rained. Welcome to the fantasy version of Colonial America, brewed up by folks who binged too much historical fiction and barely skimmed the History Channel. According to legend, our founding fathers were basically hobbits, pint-sized, perpetually grimy, and possibly ordering tea in British accents, even to their horses. In reality, most colonials weren't exactly NBA prospects. Sure, malnutrition and disease shaved a few inches off some, but no one was busting through doorways or scheduling second breakfasts. Hygiene? They did bathe, just not under modern plumbing's tyranny. Sometimes they even added flair by scenting themselves with herbs. Think less dumpster chic, more 18th century eau de rosemary. No, showers weren't daily events, but fresh linens and linen shifts soaked up sweat better than you'd expect. Soap wasn't a posh indulgence. It was homemade from animal fat and lye. And yes, folks scrubbed up for special occasions. And rumor has it, Mondays too. Rural settlers enjoyed relatively clean water, unlike their urban neighbors stuck in olfactory overcrowding. Colonial teeth weren't flawless. Blame the absence of modern dentistry, but at least their cavities weren't turbocharged by soda binges. Their dental plan mostly involved don't crunch on rocks, which, let's be honest, deserves some credit. So picture a colonial meetup smelling more like a rustic herb garden than a sewage spill. Less grimy myth, more rain dance reality. And if showers match the downpour, well, at least those rain dances counted as cardio. Misconceptions about personal habits extend to why and how the colonies were originally settled. Pilgrims fleeing persecution, Puritans clutching Bibles. So the story goes, America was founded as a holy haven for the pious. But was it really all about prayer, or were there bigger fish and fortunes to fry? Popular myth paints the colonies as cozy safe spaces for the religiously oppressed, where every new arrival was welcomed with open arms and a hymnal. Reality, of course, served up a bit more spice and cold, hard cash. Sure, Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay sprang from a burning desire for religious freedom, but they were quick learners in the art of intolerance, booting out dissenters faster than you could shout heretic. Jamestown and the Carolinas, less about Sunday sermons, more about rolling in tobacco profits. And let's be honest, colonial motto might well have been, "In God we trust," especially if his followers bring investment capital. Even colonies famed for tolerance, like Maryland, drew firm lines, especially if you failed to check the Christian box. Rhode Island and Pennsylvania pushed the envelope on real freedom, but for many, the only universal liberty was the freedom to kick out those with the wrong beliefs. Seems the path to religious freedom often ran parallel to the road to riches, both lined with gold and occasionally paved with a few well-timed excommunications. Historical generalizations often overlook the complexities of colonial religious and social conflicts. The Salem witch trials hog all the headlines, but were they the only colonial magical meltdown, or just the flashiest? Turns out, "Something wicked this way comes" wasn't Salem's exclusive catchphrase. The myth says only Massachusetts Puritans were trembling. But nope! Witch trials dotted colonial America like a light dusting of mass hysteria. Look at Hartford, Connecticut, busy pointing fingers and executing decades before Salem lit its first cauldron. Meanwhile, Virginia's lawmakers took a cooler, sometimes literally too cool, tack. Their official advice to accused witches basically boiled down to, "Ever tried not burning your neighbors?" So why does Salem 1692 snag all the historical spotlight? Simple. Record-breaking accusations, 20 executions, and enough chaos to make everyone dive under their beds. Elsewhere, colonists either gave suspicious ladies a raised eyebrow or a warning instead of a noose. With New England Puritan panic turning up the heat and the southern colonies keeping it genteel, Salem was just the blockbuster drama queen. Witch hunts, America's least fun pastime, and Salem, its undisputed headline act. Relations between settlers and Native Americans are another area where widespread myths persist. Did settlers and Native Americans instantly become best pals at first handshake? Only if your idea of best pals involves awkward silences, blank stares, and surprise appearances of smallpox. Popular myth pictures pilgrims doling out green bean casseroles and friendship bracelets. But let's be real, the first potluck was mostly confusion and a serious shortage of Tupperware. When the Mayflower crowd met the Wampanoag, it wasn't a sitcom montage of recipe swaps and bear hugs. Instead, mutual suspicion, language barriers, and plenty of confused gesturing stole the spotlight. Early alliances, like Plymouth and the Wampanoags, played out more like a strategic chess match than a heartwarming neighborhood block party. Trade, sure, but it was less, "Oh, what a thoughtful gift," and more, "Fine, I'll swap this beaver pelt if you absolutely insist." Disease, land grabs, and broken promises quickly soured the vibe. Apparently, bring a plate to share translated to smallpox and musket fire. In short, that instant friendship narrative? Pure Hallmark fantasy. History just skipped the icebreaker games. Popular stories about colonial interaction sometimes simplify the causes behind major protest actions. Picture this: an angry mob, tricorn hats askew, hurling tea overboard, not for sport, but because they supposedly despised the stuff. If colonists truly loathed tea, why wasn't there a synchronized coffee flash mob instead of maritime mayhem? The myth endures. Americans dumped tea in Boston Harbor out of raw disgust, as if the mere sight of Earl Grey sent shivers down colonial spines. But let's spill the real tea. Colonists actually loved the stuff. Tea was their go-to beverage for socializing, gossiping, and, presumably, griping about the British. The real heartburn was taxation without representation. Britain's Crafty Tea Act handed the East India Company a monopoly, making tea both cheaper, oh the irony, and a bitter symbol of Parliament's power trip. Patriots feared that sipping taxed tea would make them look like loyal royal lapdogs. Hence, the Boston Tea Party, making spilling the tea fashionable since 1773. The real crime? Not tossing biscuits in after it. Despite the aquatic carnage, America's obsession with hot drinks brewed on. The motivations behind colonial resistance tie into broader ideas about freedom in early America. Picture Colonial America. Pilgrims, powdered wigs, and a so-called paradise of liberty. Or maybe just a savvy sales pitch for oceanfront property in Salem. The popular myth says the colonies were a universal welcome mat for freedom seekers of all stripes. If colonial America was really that free, then my pet rock must be president. In truth, freedom was a fickle friend, reserved for the right color, gender, income, and preferred Bible verse. Native Americans? Their version of freedom came with a side of land loss and legal loopholes in a language they never agreed to. Colonists themselves tiptoed through a Puritan fun police state that banned dancing, flashy clothes, and sometimes even Christmas. The only ones truly carefree were the cows, though even they ended up penned in. Meanwhile, slavery anchored Southern fortunes, women's rights meant knowing how to bake and keep mum, and religious liberty came with a strict "Quakers need not apply" clause. So next time you hear about colonial America's open arms, remember, true freedom back then was more exclusive than an invite to dance in a Puritan village. Hat-style approval required. Contrary to notions of universal liberty, even daily aspects like food capture colonial hardships. Close your eyes and picture colonial America. Do you taste sawdust and sadness? If you believe the myth, our forebears dined exclusively on gruel so grim, even Dickensian orphans would raise an eyebrow, and bread so stale it doubled as home security. But let's set the soup straight. Those colonists actually ate better than your average college student. And trust me, their spice rack blew my instant ramen phase out of the water. Native American ingenuity jazzed up Old World fare with local gems like corn, squash, and peppers. No overboiled slop here. Thanks to bustling trade routes, colonial kitchens welcomed sugar, molasses, rum, not just for pirates, and even curry powder from across the sea. Cookbook pages overflowed with curries, pickles, and pastries. pickled everything, thanks to their preservation obsession. So the blandest thing at their table? Probably conversations about taxes. Move over, marshmallow yams. Colonial feasts were the original food festivals. Ready to peek inside their pantry? Common tales of colonial life often highlight individual scientific achievements amid routine hardships. Picture this: a founding father, a thunderstorm, and one of history's most electrifying science fair projects. Legend has it that Ben Franklin, armed with a kite, a key, and possibly a death wish, stumbled upon electricity during a mid-storm kite flight. Shocking, right? But before we hand the kite a Nobel Prize, let's unplug that myth. Franklin didn't discover electricity. European scientists had been fiddling with static and sparks long before Ben decided to tie a key to a storm cloud. What Franklin really did was prove that lightning and electricity were cut from the same supercharged cloth. His big breakthrough? Showing that connection and paving the way for inventions like the lightning rod, saving countless rooftops from spontaneous barbecue. And that iconic key in a lightning bolt moment? No solid proof it ever happened like that. Franklin's real feat wasn't holding the key to electricity. It was not turning himself into the founding father equivalent of toast. Now that is true enlightenment. Stories of solitary heroism stand alongside well-documented collective efforts in revolutionary times. Picture Paul Revere galloping solo through the night, townsfolk pausing their midnight snacks to watch history unfold. Just one man, one horse, and a head packed with revolutionary secrets. That's the classic image: Revere as the ultimate Lone Ranger, bravely dashing through colonial darkness while everyone else hit snooze on the American Revolution. But if Paul was truly alone, it was only because everyone else ghosted his midnight group chat invite. Here's the real scoop: Paul had company. William Dawes and Samuel Prescott teamed up for the midnight escapade. And believe it or not, over a dozen other riders fanned out to sound the bell of liberty. Revere himself? Nabbed by British patrols, didn't even make it to the finish line before the Redcoats crashed his horseplay. So why do we picture just Paul? Blame Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, whose poetic license gave Revere a solo passport to legend. The real ride was a team effort, because as any true revolutionary knows, it's always smarter to bring a buddy. Assumptions about individual acts sometimes overshadow the broader educational achievements of the period. Picture colonial New England: cobblestones, big hats, and everyone hunched over a book, right? Surely Massachusetts was bursting with brainy Puritans reciting Pilgrim poetry before breakfast and trading philosophical smackdowns at lunch. Surprise! Most folks were way better at preaching fire and brimstone than quoting Shakespeare, and universal literacy was about as real as a buy one, get one witch trial coupon. Sure, literacy rates were impressively high for the 17th century, props to the Massachusetts Law of 1647, which made towns fund public schools, but not everyone was secretly a poet laureate. Literacy usually meant you could read the Bible and maybe the neighbor's livestock inventory, writing philosophical treatises or scandalous novels. That was about as common as a pilgrim in a convertible. Men generally had the upper hand over women, rural colonies lagged behind city slickers, and immigrants and indigenous peoples often found themselves shut out of the local reading circle. And writing? Many could barely sign their names, so don't expect every colonial to have pulled off a John Hancock. With all that, it's no wonder even Puritans sometimes asked, can you help me read this communion menu? Even as literacy grew, the social dynamics within colonial towns were not always orderly. Imagine colonial towns as serene retreats of calm tea-sipping and polite neighborly nods. If only. The popular myth paints these settlements as tranquil, law-abiding utopias, where handshakes were as firm as fences and all disputes resolved with a courteous "Dear Sir." The reality? Colonists squabbled endlessly over property lines, livestock, and, even more fiercely, whether Mrs. Baxter's chickens crowed too loudly at dawn. Disputes didn't stop neatly at the picket fence. They spilled into raucous town meetings and chaotic alehouses, often accented by flying fists and the occasional tumbling tankard. Petty theft, drunken brawls, and public shaming, hello stocks, ensured daily life was spicier than serene. Peace treaties? They crumbled almost as fast as colonial curfews did. Within the same town, neighbors tangled over religion, taxes, and who just had the audacity to claim the last barrel of salt pork. Colonial governance aimed to keep things orderly on paper, but spilled beer never made the official records, except as well-earned stains. Neighborhood watch? Forget discreet cameras. Imagine a man shouting from his porch, musket at the ready. Social order in towns also influenced the roles and recognition of colonial women. Think colonial women just swapped recipes and waited for Paul Revere to gallop by? Think again. The myth casts them as powerless extras, background extras sipping tea in a powdered wig soap opera. But history isn't nearly that tidy. Colonial women weren't just churning butter, they were churning out opinions and action plans too. In reality, these ladies managed households, ran businesses, and handled legal affairs while men were off legislating. Or more likely, settling debates with a spirited duel or two. Many taverns and shops boasted formidable female bosses wielding more economic clout than some land-owning gents. And those tea parties? Sometimes clever code for lively political meetings, minus the splashy Boston Rebellion, most of the time. Take Abigail Adams, no shrinking violet. She directly influenced John Adams, and frankly anyone within letter-writing range. In emergencies, wars, plagues, or the occasional bad hair day, women stepped up as town leaders. Lacking a formal seat at the table, colonial women simply moved the chairs. If Twitter existed, #WhoRunTheColonies would break the internet. Turns out voting rights are optional when you already have the last word.